Let's begin. I'm Nancy Fitzgerald. I know all of you. Welcome. Glad to have you here. It's much more fun to give this report to an audience and to share that way. Also, thank you to Bill Free, who has volunteered to video us tonight, and so I don't have to do it again and again. Let's begin by giving thanks. Take a deep breath. Be grateful that we can choose to be peaceful, to be centered, to be in relationship and love with each other. Turn over the outcome and the questions and the presentation to God as love, and so it is. Amen. Amen. All right. There's a few repeaters here tonight. Thank you. You really are brave. I'm gonna change the sequence of what I did the last time and turn it around a little bit, kind of starting with the people toward the very end, some of whom I didn't even get to before. So I went in mid-June to Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada, to a science and spirituality conference that was sponsored by Carroll and the Kryon organization. And it took 3 years of lead time to get all the presenters there, have their calendars coordinated so they could all be there. The presenters included, the big names were Carroll, the channel for Kryon, Gregg Braden, Bruce Lipton, Lynne McTaggart, and Joe Dispenza. So I was at least a little bit familiar with all of those people, but not in depth with any of them. I was highly attracted to this conference because it was science and spirituality. And when I was in high school, I liked it all. I mean, I liked English, I liked science, I liked math, I liked home economics instead of study hall. So I did it all, but by the time I got to college, I ended up being a chemistry major. Thinking first I'd be a math major, and that didn't work out so well. So I backed what seemed like backing off to chemistry major. And then, even as I got to be an adult and I was active in a church congregation, it turns out that it always seemed like my work, which was at a research chemical engineering job, and my church didn't quite come together. There were there was a handful of people who also worked where I did, but somehow the person I was as a scientist and the person I was as a spiritual or believing person of faith didn't quite seem to click. So when I saw this conference, I was pretty sure that what I wanted to do was just go sit in it and see what happened. You know, see what came of it, and see if I couldn't move my science Nancy and my spiritual Nancy preferably over top of each other, but at least closer together, so I could be me without somehow thinking I had to sort of look over my shoulder to see what somebody from a different persuasion might think. All right. Before the conference even started, there was a field trip to Bouchard Gardens in Victoria, which was gorgeous, absolutely beautiful, and there was a short opening channel from Kryon through Carroll, and he had another channeler with him as well. But the message was, we are here to hear the science of consciousness, and that science is catching up with consciousness. So that tended to be the message as we went. And the other thing, one of my impressions was that I feel like I'd been completely out of science since I left it 20 years ago. And that's pretty much true in some ways. But the other thing is that a lot of what we heard is not reported, certainly not thoroughly, if at all, in the mainstream press. And it's partly because the ideas are so radically different in some cases that it's a threat to the money and the power and the ego and the habit of the people who like it the way it is, whoever those people are. So I want to start with talking a little bit about the channeler Lee Carroll. He was trained as an engineer, and he's been channeling Kryon for 29 years. So it took him some doing to get from his mechanical engineering, or I think it was mechanical engineering, mindset to being able to do this. And he's done it pretty much full time since then. So he still has some science training and background and whatever. He and one of his, as he says, one of his former wives with whom he's still friends is Jan Tober, wrote these books on the indigo children, which I'd heard of indigo children. I didn't realize there were books that introduced the idea. At the time, they were primarily describing a phenomena of children that were coming in as a different kind of, in a different kind of evolution or humanity, ready born with a different kind of mindset. So on the back, this is the first book. On the back of it here, it says, he says, can we really be seeing human evolution in kids today? And how come a lot of our children today seem to be system busters? Why are so many of our brightest kids being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder? And are there proven working alternatives to Ritalin? So it was kind of relatively early on. On the other hand, when this book was published in 1999, my son had graduated from high school already. He had been diagnosed with ADD. He was on Ritalin until he took himself off of it. So it feels to me like I had a pre-sample of what this might be, and they decided that they needed to at least describe the phenomena. And then they picked up and did a book 10 years later and says the indigo children 10 years later as teenagers entering the workforce, doing some other kinds of things. So those are two that I want to catch up with. I have to tell you, I have all these books at this point. I have hardly read them all. I got them partly because of the interest that was stirred up at the conference, not so much because I had worked with them beforehand. Okay, then the goddess presenter among them, Lynne McTaggart, I was familiar with because I had read her book maybe 5 to 8 years ago. It came out maybe a little before that, The Field. And she is a journalist by trade, and a good one, and fearless. And what she had done at the time is gotten wind of scientists who were beginning to believe, especially physicists, who were beginning to believe from their research that there was more going on than we were paying attention to, that there was an expanse of energy, that there were interconnections, that there was power in light. You know, at that point, it was well past Einstein putting out E equals mc squared, where it basically says you can get energy if you take matter and you multiply it by a huge number, the speed of light squared, then that's how much energy you get out of some amount of mass that's measurable. So she, in this one of the more recent books, The Intention Experiment, she's moved to the place where she has recognized that what we focus on is what we get. You know, that if we intend something, that's what's drawn to us, because that's where our focus is, because that's where our energy is. It's like an attractive force. And there's so many parallels between all of the teachers that we're now more familiar with, like Abraham, like Byron Katie, like, her intention experiment, that the similarities are that, and Joe Dispenza spends a lot of time and energy on it, that if you focus on something, that's where your energy is, and that's what you can get back from you. So in here, there were a couple things I wanted to mention. First of all, the idea that they kept using the term quantum and Newtonian energy. And I have to say that, they talked about quantum energy so long ago when I was doing my undergraduate work, but it never quite clicked. to me, quantum was in chemistry when the location of the electron orbitals around the nucleus were predictable based on the element and the charge in the nucleus, the protons and the number of neutrons. And then if there was going to be a chemical reaction and it was a heavy element, the first layer was predictable because that's where it all started. But then the next one was what they called a quantum leap beyond that, meaning it wasn't gradual, it wasn't anywhere in between level 1 and level 2. It was either in level 1, and this is a sphere around the nucleus, and it's spinning all around, it's not even located really. And then it goes from level 1 to level 2 and boom. But which means that it has to get enough energy somehow to get that amount of energy, and it's measurable for every element, how much energy it takes to get from level 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 or 3 to 4, depending if the element's big enough to do that. And so to me, quantum was just a measurable amount of energy in a fixed amount. Now the way it's being used is way broader than that, where it means basically light energy and energy that comes from something other than mass and force and acceleration. The beginning was, the easy thing that we got taught in physics was Newtonian. There was I took Physical Science Study Committee physics, and they gave us little wheel carts that could take paper tape through them and have a little clicker on them based on how fast the wheels were going, and it would put carbon dots on a tape. So you could count the dots and decide whether it was accelerating or going a constant speed or whatever. And we did all these experiments where I can remember sitting out, I was in Florida at the time, sitting out on a lawn chair in the sun trying to count these dots and answer the questions that they kept asking it. But basically it was physical. It was stuff that you could see, feel, taste, touch, or measure. Like mass, how much does it weigh? Like the force of it. So how many pounds of force are there? Like acceleration. So how far does it go in what amount of time? So that's all Newtonian physics, and it's pretty much where we have gotten stuck because it's easy to understand. It, up until this point, worked pretty well at explaining the world, but now that more and more science is being done, the idea that quantum energy and light and other kinds of forces that may not be visible, have not all been figured out to be measured, that they also have an impact. And in fact, it's like way bigger impact because it talks really about, it's often used sometimes, like Joe Dispenza uses it as, you get to the quantum level if you do all the training and the coaching that he gives. He calls it the 5th dimension. But one of the evening programs I chose as an extra was a channeler who had built this, what he called a Stargate structure. I might have my picture of it nearby. It's like this. He had little models that were this tall, this copper tubing kind of thing, and he had ones that were tall enough for people to like lie down in the base of it. If you want to pass that around. And that, he says, broadcasts energy all the time. When we went for that program in the evening, he took us through 2 meditations. The first one, he took us up 12 dimensions. And believe me, I could feel the energy in that room when we got that far. In that case, there were fewer than the total number of people, maybe 400 or 500, but you could just almost feel it pulsing once you got up that high. So it's that kind of energy that in some ways we all know exists, but we're discouraged to report because it was poo-pooed, it was not physics, it was not science, it was woo-woo, that kind of thing. And it's partly why my science self was over here and my spirit self was over here. in my congregation way back when, I remember it was a big deal when somebody finally had the willingness to share with other small group of people that they had seen an aura of colors around our minister when she was talking about the book she'd written. And it was like, like me, I came from a German and English set of parents who were loving but not particularly demonstrative or affectionate, and I don't know that they actually squished that kind of thing down, but somehow I got the message. You know how you get messages at home without knowing where they come from, that no, we don't go there. You know, we don't allow things to be extraordinary or unusual or other than what you can feel, taste, touch.
Who is this guy that did this copper tube?
His name is Prajeet Harris. He's from Manchester, England. He had traveled over to do the conference. I noticed he's with, Kryon's putting together a program soon with 4 channelers. Prajeet is one of them, and Lee Carroll is Kryon's another. Marilyn Harper, who you probably heard when you went to hear Kryon recently, channels Adironda, and another woman who I'm not as familiar with. So it's just the idea that that I allow into my life and at least my observation and my experience, the idea of channelers, and that I've heard them and listened to them and mostly found that their messages are loving, positive, and helpful.
Is there a piece of quartz in the middle of that?
That picture has a piece of quartz in it, but the Stargate structure itself did not, at least not the ones that I saw.
I was going to say, that's a smaller one, right?
That's probably
Yeah,
a miniature that they took a picture
I
of.
was like, that's a good piece of quartz. It was big.
Yes, I'm assuming so. I got this at the end of the conference when I used all my Canadian coins to get the one that would match up with using up all my coins.
It's kind of like us trying to get rid of the euros.
Yes. I want to talk a little bit about the venue too. It's Vancouver Island is a barrier island off the coast of Vancouver. It's on the inside of the ocean. In other words, it's a barrier between the full of Vancouver and the ocean directly, but Nanaimo is the name of the little city that we were in on Vancouver Island, and it's on the calmer side. So it had this lovely waterfront that we got to walk to and from all the time. And I believe Kryon said the first channel that they were expecting 1,200 people. Instead, by the end of, and they started with their full programming on Thursday and Friday, when Thursday all day long it was Gregg Braden who presented. Friday it was Joe Dispenza. Saturday and Sunday they'd set up the program so that all the major presenters gave a little bit. So people who could only come for the weekend, especially the local Canadians who came in, would get a sample of everything. And then Monday was, who's missing? It must have been, gets a little mixed up here. It wasn't Bruce Lipton, he had an evening program. So it must have been, Monday must have been Lynne McTaggart, and Tuesday was Kryon, or was Lee Carroll. He did a little bit of channeling, but mostly he taught about the Lemurian teaching wheel on the last day. So Sunday night, at the peak of the attendance, instead of 1,200 that they'd predicted, there were 1,800 people there. I mean, we were filling every seat in this little auditorium. This is a little barrier island. This is a small city. There were restaurants by Saturday and Sunday that were running out of food and closing. By Sunday night, when we all left to go out and probably eat and or leave, they said, maybe, they told us some of the restaurants aren't even open anymore at this point. Maybe you'd want to go to the little shopping center nearby where the grocery store has some nice prepared food. My roommate and I had been there. It was nice, so we were headed that way. And somebody's coming back from that direction toward us, and they say, "You wouldn't happen to be going to the grocery store, would you?" Yeah, we think we are. And she says, "Well, forget it." She said, the electricity is down and the whole shopping center has been closed. So the energy of the 1,800 people and the channeling and the presentation was enough to shut that down. And Kryon routinely says he needs a wired microphone, not a battery-operated microphone, because he blows the batteries out. And so that like 3 or 4 times during the channeling, he has to have the batteries replaced. And in fact, on his watch, he took his watch off as well. Carroll took his watch off before he started the channel because he says, I also go through batteries like crazy, and my local jeweler knows that. So even when he takes it off and sets it aside, he goes through it. Monday, when I went back in the evening to hear Prajit Harris, as I was walking home about 10 or 10:30, there were all these sirens, and I saw one ambulance pull up to a pretty dark building, and one guy got in. And I thought, that doesn't quite explain all this sirens and rigmarole and what's going on, but I couldn't tell what was going on. The next day, we heard that the other side of Nanaimo had had the electricity shut down on Monday evening, presumably because, I mean, we don't know, of course, but presumably because the energy of the group and the message and the receiving was so strong. I'll do that in a minute. All right, so Lynne McTaggart, I don't know if I have this right or not, talks about in the intention experiment. What she does, she also has a follow-up book to this one, I believe, that's called The Power of 8, where basically she has 8 people in a circle. Often they're people who get together and do this regularly, and what they do is they let someone in the circle choose something that they want everybody in the circle to focus on to their benefit, whatever that is. A new job, a healing, a lifting of depression, whatever it is. And for a total of something like only 2 or 3 minutes, all the people, including the proposed recipient, focus their intention on that single request. And then they watch for the results, and they get them, as we can imagine, can know. That she did it for all of us. She had us pull into circles in this crowded, big conference room and do it. And then there were some people who had enough of a result, a big enough result that they stood up and shared. And there were things like something lifted. There were results, as we know. So she calls that one Power of 8, and this the intention experiment. I was very grateful that they included a female in the science and spirituality. I appreciate that as a journalist she brings a much broader perspective to what she's reporting on. She gets multiple sources, which a lot of times aren't necessarily the case for people who are doing their own research or have their own group. And so she's got good questions, so she chases the answer to questions that you might not otherwise consider or get answered. And then I was thinking that she was Monday, so it was like toward the end of the conference, and my roommate and I listened to her in the morning, but we didn't stay in the afternoon. And I was wondering partly why that was true, and as a self kind of thing, I'm thinking, oh well, she's a woman and she's not a scientist, so I was feeling a little bit like maybe I was judging her poorly. And then the next thing was, oh, am I judging myself in the same way, in that even when I was working as a research chemical engineer, my job more often was communicator or connector. Even if I had a project, I would read the basics, and then I'd go to all the experts and find out what everybody would suggest, and then put it together, and then published my proposed research plan for input or correction before we invested whatever it was in it, and then report it at the end. So it was an interesting kind of thing that came to me personally that might be related to the work she's doing. Okay, here's the next one. Any questions so far? I feel like
I
it's a
just have
little.
a question about the power of 8. When you, there were a lot of you
Mhm.
at this conference. There were more than 8 of you getting together, and or was it?
No, it was 8 groups of 8 all over the auditorium.
Oh.
So it was a little bit, you know, it was like all the chairs were situated so they could hold 1,200 people, and then we pulled them in and then we put them back, you know. So it was a little complicated, but yeah, we did it, and we practiced it and tried it at the time.
I think that's great.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like another credit that I give to Lynne McTaggart is she's making it much more, all of this kind of science and intention kind of thing, much more mainstream, accessible, available, usable to people who may or may not be doing Course in Miracles or Abraham Hicks or any of the other kinds of things that would help guide that. So she's helping spread it in a different way than some of these other people are. All right, the next presenter I want to talk about is Joe Dispenza. He is amazing. He had 4 90-minute sessions, as all the all-day presenters did in a day, with 30-minute breaks in between to get 1,200 to 1,800 people to the bathroom and back. Of course, the worst was the women. And you got so you knew where the farthest reaches bathrooms were, and I'd go zipping across the bridge and down the stairs and around the corner, and that one was usually pretty empty. But then you'd still get to stand in a line often, and there'd be somebody next to you. In one case, I'd been sitting for a while, and the lady ahead of me was jogging, and I thought, oh, that would feel good to jog. So I jogged alongside of her. When we got in line behind each other, I mentioned something about the cool thing about how many channels I realized that I was paying attention to, or how many materials and resources I now have been exposed to and valued and found useful. First of all, of course, there's A Course in Miracles. Then there's A Course in Love. Then there's things like Glenda Green's report as an artist, when she was painting Jesus with the lion and the lamb, of having Jesus appear to her as she painted and having conversations with him, which she then published. One chapter in there, which I still vow to go back and reread sometime, is Jesus on science. And so he talks about things like, when she asks him, well, what about the law of conservation of energy? And she said, Glenda Green described Jesus' expression. She says, well, he tried not to break out into laughter. You know, he had a little smile on his face, but he said, well, it works fine to as far as you apply it, to the scope that you have and understand to apply it to. He says, but it turns out it's only, I forget what the percentage is, it was tiny, like 10% of the universe where energy or conservation of energy matters. And so it turns out that he also promoted the idea that everything is a compression and an expansion, and the force that causes that to happen is love. So the power of unlimited energy is ultimately love. So it's one more example of, in my life, lots of materials that have come to remind me that I can let these things in. There's lots of them. They're being known and seen. So, Lisa, maybe you would want to tell the story of Joe healing himself after his accident. Do you remember to speak it?
He's I think he's like 56 now, so when he was 20, 22 or 3 or 4. He just finished his chiropractic studies. He was in a bike race, and he was in a triathlon, and he got hit by a SUV, broke his spine in 8 places. They said he'll never walk again. And he basically had already heard of these ideas that there's a force and an intelligence that can heal you. And he basically made a decision, 2 decisions. The first decision that he was going to work with this force and this intelligence and totally surrender to get healing him. And the second thing was that he was going to let a single thought not in line with his intention to get by his awareness. So he spent 8 weeks, couldn't walk. He said, if you get out of this bed, your spine is going to collapse like an accordion. You'll never walk again.
And he passed up surgery options, right?
Yep, and these 3 doctors said, you have to get these pins. And he just knew. He'd already heard intellectually these ideas, and so he basically for 8 weeks in bed, he held the vision of himself as totally healed and out in the grass eating a picnic and outside, and he realized how he'd taken all these things for granted. But he said he would do these meditations, and if a single thought came in, like you'll never walk again, he made himself start from the beginning.
He walked through all the vertebrae, right?
He would go through,
everything that was
right.
damaged. He counted through them all, so if he got all the way to the end -1, he'd still.
Yep. So he'd be healing like every. He saw this life and this force energy doing its work. Like he was collaborating with the intelligence, and his part was to not lose the focus and the vision of that. And he said there was a moment where he got through the whole meditation, and he said it was like he knew something had changed, and then he started walking. And he basically was up and working out again at 8 weeks. I think he was
within
back.
weeks of when he started all this.
Yep.
Yeah, so he was the first. He was the demonstration, right? He was the experiment. He did it on himself, and it worked with astounding results.
Mhm.
And then he got. I think he dedicated himself into studying or in learning about
Yep.
teaching, transferring the information that he had used and expanding it, and that's pretty much what
Yeah,
he's done.
he said, if I'm healed, I will dedicate the rest of my life to teaching this. And so what he does is he's got the scientists hooking people up in his workshops to prove that when you hit that consciousness, like slowing down your brain waves, moving from
Yeah, he
whatever it
calls
is,
it-
theta to beta to alpha, or
Yeah, he calls it, when you get to now, the generous present moment, or the eternal now, then your brain waves are coherent. So instead of 3 or 4 waves, like just scrambled, they're all in the same wave pattern, one on top of the other. So they're all congruent and in power. And yeah, they almost all of, even like Lynne McTaggart also, all of them are now measuring people physiologically to show the changes when they implement whatever the method is, the version or the tweak on the method that they're using. Yeah. So the book that I'd read by Joe Dispenza before was "You Are the Placebo." I mean, to me that title is the message. It's like what you believe is true is what's going to heal you, even if you get the sugar pill instead of the pill with medicine. So that's the one, and in that one he goes through all the biology, and he traces the whole track. You can go from here to here to here to here to here to here to, and I wasn't as much of a biologist, so that one didn't, and that's been a while since I read that one, so it didn't stick as much. This one He's at the place, now this is becoming supernatural. This is his most recent one within the last couple years. He's moving toward taking a handful of people for a longer period of time and taking them as far as they can go in that time to help them learn it, implement, and demonstrate it. Apparently something like 3/4 of the people who are participating in those workshops are repeats. So they get enough good stuff that they want to do more and get deeper and get better at it, that they come back. In this book, he talks about, he tells stories, like there's about interspersed 2 or 3 different chapters where he gives case results or what happened. He explains in chapter 2 what it means to be in the present moment, which was what he calls the 5th dimension, and is known as quantum or the unified field, or what Lynne McTaggart referred to in her book way back when as just the field, meaning the energy field, the source way out there. I think 5th dimension means you've at least broken loose of our humanness, but because Prajit took us to 12 dimensions in the meditation, I think 5 is, who knows whether it's 5 or not, but it's outside our experience routinely.
The holy instant.
Yeah, the eternal now, the holy instant, the generous present moment is what he calls it. Where he's got a diagram with when you're in that place, that there is no familiar past, so you're not paying any attention to your past, and there's no predictable future. That no predictable future theme came up in multiple different ways in this conference. One of the things that Kryon said was, don't expect your future to be like your past. And partly you don't want to do that because whatever you're expecting is what you're putting your energy toward. You're predicting, you're making it happen by doing that. But even the whole idea of understanding that, how I'm catching myself all the ways and times that I think, oh, this is how we did it before, that's how it'll be this time. It doesn't have to be that way. And so it's up to us to get ourselves out of that rut and allow the new and different changes. What else here? Then he has introduction to the quantum world, the 5th dimension, and he has blessing of the energy centers. He goes through an introducing a breath that's the start of meditations that enables your body to change your energy, run an electrical current through your body, create a more powerful electromagnetic field around you. Okay, and again, he's one of the people who's measuring all kinds of things now on the subjects who go through this. Were you? I know you and Bill participated in a workshop.
I was with him for 3 days. It's called the pineal gland meditation.
Mm-hmm.
It is crazy. And he basically makes everybody sit, and then what he does is he makes you pull in a breath all the way down. Okay.
Oh, deeper,
Okay.
deeper, deeper.
Again, you have to keep pulling the breath. You cannot let the breath out. And then what he said is that what it does, and you're pulling in. So you're pulling the breath in. I think you're pulling it down. Like imagine it here. You're pulling it down. You're sucking in, and you keep breathing it. Breathing the light in, breathing it won't, and he's up there screaming, "Go, keep going, you got this." But then what he does is when you push it out, you're actually aligning the energy centers. So the energy of the breath is now pulling all the scattered energies, which is what the disease is.
Well, it's kind of like creating a vacuum and pulling it in.
Creating a vacuum.
Yeah, and like he says, creating an electrical current. It's like creating an attraction, an energy that would attract all the things that are out of synchrony, and bring them up and out.
Yeah, I just bought it. I have it in the car actually, but it's called the pineal gland. You can buy all of the meditations on iTunes.
Yes, and there's a chapter here on the pineal gland and what it means to create heart coherence. Both Gregg Braden and Joe Dispenza and Lynne McTaggart in a different form, but the first two both used the Heart Math Institute, which was established, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago at least, and they focused their research to measuring things about the heart and its function. And so they have screens. One of the audience members got up on the stage, and she volunteered, so she was up there by choice, and they had one screen.
We did that in Portland.
Yeah?
Carroll
Cool.
had those.
He's using it now too, then. So the one screen that shows a pattern, a wave pattern for the brain, and the other screen that shows a wave pattern for the heart, and you can actually see when they finally get into sync and they're traveling together, and it's at that point that you're moving toward that eternal now, the calm, the peace, the predictability, the ability to be more flexible and adaptable and open to hearing. You're able to listen. Almost all of them have some version of what our Sunday group calls either the atonement or forgiveness or pause kind of methodology that the Course mentions in lots of different ways. And it all sounds a little bit different, but once you've seen the sequence, it's all pretty much the same. It's pointing to the same phenomena and just different coaching on how to get there from here. He does he talks about a walking meditation. He talks about pineal gland. So I was saying that he did the first 90 minutes. He was like pacing back and forth up and across the stage, and he'd stop. As Lisa had pointed out earlier, and say, "Are you with me?" And everybody have to say yes, or stop and sit. Explain to the person next to you what I just said, So you had to be like listening and paying enough attention that you could explain it to each other. Yeah.
Talk about being aware of what's going on.
And when that 90 minutes was over, I practically had to shake my head loose. And we went up and take our break. And then what he did is essentially repeat pretty much the same message the next 3 times in this way and this way and this way. But it was all pretty much the same thing.
I don't know if you know this, but he's trained as a hypnotherapist.
Oh no, I didn't know
He
that.
hypnotizes everybody, I'm positive.
Oh,
I'm not kidding, he does. He's definitely, he was trained before the bike accident. That was his whole silver mine method or something. And
That's
so-
why you had to shake it out.
Yeah, probably.
Well,
That's why you do whatever he
It's terrific
says.
though, because he holds you in that vibration.
He says to do it, and you go, okay, I'll do it.
So that hypnosis is another form of energy. It's like we don't see it.
Right.
It's part of the quantum energy field, not the Newtonian energy field, but we feel the effects. It's like miracles and hypnosis and what we think of as supernatural events, bells ringing across the room when I was initiated in Reiki 1. There were only 2 of us in the room, the woman who was training me, and she had her hands on my shoulders, and all the way across the room there was a set of bells on the doorknob, and it rang. And somehow there's part of me that, at least at that stage, wasn't even hardly paying attention to those kind of things. It's like, oh, that I observed it and let it in, but it's not like it's almost like I didn't quite give it credence because it didn't jive, with the traditional way we were all raised and what was going on. But we all have those kinds of experiences, probably more than we can easily rattle off. Some people are really good at remembering them. I'm not necessarily one of them. All right, the next presenter was, or actually I'm going backwards, but another presenter was Bruce Lipton. The Biology of Belief is his publication, and actually it was published, I think it was in 2004, and this edition is already the 10th anniversary edition, so this updated edition's already been out 3 or 4 years, he did make some additions and sometimes corrections at the end of different chapters in here. But so this science was already established in the scientific world, peer-reviewed and published when he published it in 2004. And now it still strikes me as brand new. And again, it goes back to it's not being reported in the mainstream press because of what it threatens. There's a couple of things out of here that were really amazing to me. The first was that he was a cell biologist, so he was studying individual cells in the beginning. And the conventional wisdom, and probably still what's taught in the majority of high schools and even medical schools, he was saying, is that the DNA in the nucleus of the cell is the powerhouse of the cell. It's the brain, it's what controls everything. In fact, his research showed, at least 15 years ago, that it wasn't the genes in the nucleus, it was actually the cell membrane that was the brain of the cell, and that the cell membrane is permeable to certain kinds of molecules, kind of like, I don't know if you know, but like a soap molecule has two ends, where one end is like water, and so that end can dissolve in water, and the other end is like a fat. So that end can attract grease or fat out of the dirty clothes, and then when the detergent gets washed out, both ends go, but it's taken the dirt out with it. So it's like a dual function molecule, and it's that kind of a molecule that goes through the membrane of every cell, which he calls, every cell is intelligent, is what he says. He says when you get them all together, they behave according to the group vote. Or maybe we might say the ego, but cell by cell, every cell has got like a yes/no kind of a switch. So the membrane is semi-permeable, and it can let certain kinds of proteins through the membrane. On this side is something that receives signals, and on this side is something that then translates it to messages for the cell. So for instance, if all of a sudden I hear a loud explosion and it feels like it's right in my house, all of a sudden I've got some adrenaline and cortisol in my blood, and this signal receptor for that cell that's nearby picks it up. And it translates through the cell membrane into the cell, and now the cell has two choices. It can be either in protection mode, and if it's adrenaline and cortisol, it essentially goes to protection mode. And so the things that shut down are like your digestion, and what gets activated are your extremities. So if you have to fight something off, your legs, your arms, that they're ready to go. You're a certain kind of alertness, but a very short-term alertness. You're not in eternal now. You're not open. You're not open to all possibilities. You're just monitoring your environment to see what's going on. So that's one. The other one is growth. So the opposite would be if and when we meditate or get ourselves into these locations that almost all these presenters described, then your body's getting very different signals. Now they're getting signals from, I think one of the molecules he talks about is, I think he calls it IgA, which is an immunoglobulin, and it's growth promoting. The more of it there is, the more your body can be in repair and growth mode. So our whole body replaces itself. All the cells are replaced, I think I've heard, every 7 years or something like that. So all the time, when we're calm enough to be in growth mode, our body's replacing those cells that just died and need to be replaced. Or if you're young, you're actually growing to your full adult size. But if you're like Joe Dispenza and you're mature, but you're now sending messages to your cells that say, okay, repair this vertebrae, and then this vertebrae, and then this vertebrae, then the cell's in growth mode to do what signal our minds are sending it to. So it's not genes, it's the cell membrane. And one of the implications of that is all this conventional wisdom that if you have a gene for breast cancer, for instance, or sickle cell anemia, that it's inevitable, or there's a certain probability that you're going to get it. It really doesn't hold. We may get those things because we've now been told that if you have it, you're going to get it. And so now part of you is believing that if your mom had this, then you're going to get it. If your dad died of this, then your brother may die of that. But in fact, all the genetic predictability is not what we've been taught. It's new, it's different. And it goes back to what you choose to focus on. And I can't help but refer to A Course in Miracles, because most of us are familiar with that. You know, if you're either choosing fear or you're choosing love. And so that overall choice affects cell by cell by cell, and then it affects your whole body in some kind of a gradient. Your body, I guess, gets some kind of a vote, and every cell doesn't change at once. You know, so it's like it can be in a different mode. So part of you might be in stress, and part of you is happy that you're eating out with friends. And so it's the group vote, but nevertheless, it's from the result of cell by cell by cell by cell, either being in protection or in growth mode, and our thoughts our choices sending either love or fear, peace or stress.
What you want, what you don't want.
Right, concentrating on what you want or what you don't want, exactly. All right, what was I going to read in here? I think this is just a little bit different way of saying this one, but and Bruce Lipton also realized as a scientist that he'd been successful professionally, although he had done all this research. It was peer reviewed. It was publishable, and he asked for permission from the university where he was to publish it, and they refused. It was so radical that they refused him permission. So what he ended up doing, he was a tenured professor. He ended up resigning his tenured profession to be able to go do this kind of thing, you know, to teach and say what he needed to say and do. And he realized that he was professionally successful, but that his personal life was a mess. And he was smart enough to realize that, oh, I could change my thoughts. I could start focusing on what I want in my personal life instead of 3 failed marriages, a good relationship. And in fact, now he's been in one for something like 22 years.
So
and
you must have did that a long time ago.
It's been a while.
He was probably not very old when he gave up his tenure.
I don't know exactly how old he was. I think he's maybe in his late 60s at this point. In that,
Still.
in that, whatever. Yeah.
That's huge to believe in something that strong.
Yes.
Give up something that secure.
Yes. Yes. And I don't know at what point he realized he could make personal choices differently that would give him a better personal life, whether that was before or after he left the university.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's pretty gutsy, huh? I mean,
Yeah.
it's like walking away from
Because
what
as
looks
a
like.
professor, that's like your number one goal in life, is to get into a good university and then become a tenured professor in the university.
So you can
Like-
do whatever you want, right? But whatever research you think is important. But in fact, that wasn't working for him
Yeah,
because
the
they
school
were.
wasn't letting him do it. Or-
So to do what
The
he
public
hoped
himself.
tenure would have granted him, he ended up giving up tenure instead. But yeah, it's a
That's
big deal.
impressive.
And there's nothing that says that your peers won't completely discount you. If you
Exactly.
resign from a tenured position, it makes them wonder what's going on.
What I think is pretty fascinating is 3 failed marriages, as you say, and then he focused on, much like Joe Dispenza, only the positive. That is some powerful mind training.
Yes, it is.
And it worked for him, as you said. He's still in this marriage, however many years later.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's like the case studies, the examples, and we can do it for ourselves. Almost every one of us in this room can point to things that we've made a deliberate decision about, and it got better once we focused on what we wanted instead of what we didn't want, or let go of the my future's going to be like my past idea. I mean, any of those kind of things are all pointing to the same thing. So here, this is again going to the yes/no in each individual cell, I believe. But there's a catch to these opposing survival mechanisms that have evolved over billions of years. It turns out that the mechanisms that support growth and protection cannot operate optimally at the same time. So it's either one or the other. In other words, cells cannot simultaneously move forward and backward. The human blood vessels I studied at Stanford exhibited one microscopic anatomy for providing nutrition and a completely different microscopic anatomy for providing a protection response. So it literally rearranged the parts of the cell that were in play and functioning depending on what the signals were at the time. Growth processes require an open exchange between an organism and its environment. For example, food is taken in and waste products are excreted. However, protection requires a closing down of the system to wall the organism off from the perceived threat. Growth is a process that not only expends energy but is also required to produce energy. Consequently, sustained protection response inhibits the creation of life-sustaining energy. The longer you stay in protection, the more you consume your energy reserves, which in turn compromise your growth. In fact, you can shut down growth processes so completely that it becomes a truism that you can be, quote, scared to death. To fully experience your vitality, it takes more than just getting rid of life stressors. It takes in a growth protection continuum, eliminating the stressors only puts you at the neutral point in the range. To fully thrive, we must not only eliminate the stressors, but also actively seek joyful, loving, fulfilling lives that stimulate the growth process. Let's see if there's anyone else here. And then at the end, he talks about himself being a spiritual scientist. That's not how he started. And he's saying, even though the body of the person who, psychological and behavioral memory does not make sense if we realize that the transplanted organs still bear the original identity receptors of a donor and are apparently still downloading that same environmental information. So if somebody receives a donor heart, they can receive information that came with that heart, things like cravings for French fries and beer, or
Oprah did shows on that.
hmm?
Oprah did shows, because that's the first time I ever heard of That's potato chips.
Yes, yes.
Someone had gotten a heart, and that was that person's favorite potato chip, and they said this, I think it was a lady that got the heart, she's like, tells her husband one day, yeah, I want some of those barbecue potato chips, those oops or whatever.
Yeah, something she never had done before,
Yeah.
right?
Change of Heart, that book, I forgot the author, but she
really?
had a heart transplant from a young man who was like 18 and in a motorcycle accident. And he liked beer and chicken McNuggets, and she was a dancer and really into holistic stuff. And all of a sudden, she craved
McDonald's,
chicken
here we
McNuggets
go.
and beer.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so that's part of the, that's a better example than I pulled out, thank you.
The cell DNA,
It remembers everything.
Yeah. So even though the body of the person who donated the organs is dead, their broadcast is still on. So there's the energy. That's a different kind of energy, right? A quantum energy, a non-visible, otherwise, so far unmeasurable, unknown to us. Therefore, it doesn't exist, right? That's been the rule of thumb in my lifetime, for sure. Some of you who are younger may be feeling different kinds of things as it shifts, because it is shifting. And then they are, as I realized in my flash of insight while mulling over the mechanics of the cellular membrane, immortal as I believe we all are. And then he says, because environment represents all that is, God, and our self-receptor antennas download only a narrow band of the whole spectrum, we all represent a small part of the whole, a small part of God. So it's like we each download part of the energy spectrum, and that's our unique signature, to the point where if our hearts are put in somebody else's body, something about us goes with it.
Well, you think, it's something that you kind of think about even before you put this together, because the heart, especially a heart transplant, because the heart is probably the number one talked about organ other than the brain, because it does so much stuff. Like, it's your pump, it keeps you going, but it's also, you love muscle.
Somebody, I'm mixing up.
I think its consciousness is larger than the brain.
Yeah, I think it is
The
too,
energy
the
of the
heart.
heart is larger than the brain.
It's actually the central chakra, the central energy system. There's three below, the bodily, worldly chakras, the family system, the one-on-one relationships, the power center or self-worth kind of thing. Then there's the heart, and then it goes to your ability to speak, to speak your truth, and then your third eye, so your ability to see things that aren't Newtonian visible, but to receive that information, and then the top one, that's the light and the openness to the other dimensions and what's up there, but that it's a center. And again, it goes back to the brain and the heart coherence, and it's really pulling the heart into it all. We're good in our society in being in our brains, being thinking, rationalizing, collecting data, doing due diligence. I heard that term again the other day, and I realized how I don't feel quite the same way about it anymore. If I'm getting a strong message that says, yeah, I'm just supposed to do that. I don't have to check with the lawyer. I don't have to look up the details. I just do it. But it's a muscle that needs to be practiced. This is Gregg was the first presenter. Human by Design is his
Is that the newest one?
newest book, I believe.
I want to get that one.
Yeah, and this refers to, and I'll read you some of this here, but this refers to the idea, and I don't know whether he isn't doing this. I don't know that he did this research, but somehow he's pulled it all together and made this story so compelling that it's hard to ignore. And it's the one that says that human evolution is, that evolution is true, but just not for humans. So that they've actually proven, there's scientific data now that says two ways. One is, the hypothesis was before, and even in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the lines that connect supposed ancestors of humans to our, what's now called anatomically modern human, were dotted lines. They were inferred. They weren't true. But one of the most recent connections was supposed to be to Neanderthal man. They have been able to prove definitively that we are not related to Neanderthals. They were able to do that because of the completion not too long ago of the full genetic code. Remember when they were like mapping the whole set of codes, and they believed that they needed at least I think it's something like 210,000 genes to be able to create a human body from genetic composition. That's how many it would take. One of the reasons it got funded is because there were deep pockets, and including politicians, who thought that we would have a better economy if you could make a drug for every gene that did something or that caused a disease or was connected to something that was important. And so that project, I remember thinking when they said they were going to do this, that they were, and they did it in amazingly fast time, like huge number of measurements in, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, 2 or 3 years, I don't know, not very long, and it was well funded, including government money that helped make it happen. But it turned out that only something like 10% of the genes that were mapped actually connected to something that we know as a disease or a predictable or whatever. And the rest they called, guess what? Junk. Because we didn't understand it, right? It was like we didn't know what it was about, so it had to be junk because we couldn't explain it. One possible explanation is what Kryon proposes as Kryon, not Lee Carroll, but as the entity that channels, is that in fact it is information storage for all our past lives and emotions and experiences. It is the Akash, the Akashic record of everything this soul or being had up until this point.
On the earth.
On the earth. That could be.
On this planet.
Okay, you probably, yeah.
Yeah, just on this planet.
Okay, not in the whole galaxy and all the star system. That makes
Not on other planets.
Just-
it's so
Just here.
it's huge enough here
Yeah, it's
that the
huge.
idea that is that the idea that it's that subset doesn't bother me at
So
all.
you say like everything, like from all your lives, all your past until you're done.
Our record in
Is
your
in that.
DNA, which means that record is in every cell of your body. Every cell of your body, not just some of them, not just in certain part of your physiology, but literally in every cell of your body. Then the other way they know that humans really don't fit evolution, that is that, shoot, I lost it, wait a minute.
You have all day.
Okay, I said we're not connected to Neanderthals. Oh, we are connected to, there was a place genetically about 200,000 years ago when one gene merged. Two genes became one. A gene looks a little bit like a long rectangle with two prongs on this end, which are telomeres, the things that get shorter as you get older, and two more telomeres on the other end. And this chromosome number 2 merged, and what then became superfluous telomeres were eliminated, and the bulk of the genes were there. It has twice the volume or the weight of the other chromosomes, and the other telomeres are still there. So that, and they can show that because they found a fossil of a baby, a Neanderthal, I think it was a Neanderthal baby, a girl, and they were able to extract genetic material and analyze it according to the new mapping that's been done. And so then they could show that that mapping did not match our mapping, and that way back 200,000 years ago, it did match. I'll read from here with...
Didn't it show that we have a fused, like one of them that the
That's it.
telomeres are fused? Right?
Yes, that's it, chromosome 2, the fused chromosome. And didn't you ever wonder why 23 seems kind of like an odd number for a number of chromosomes? I mean, a lot of things are paired or so it turns out one set of chromosomes is double, all but double, not quite, but all but double. So the idea that humans haven't evolved randomly from random mutations of genes, but in fact there was some, Gregg Braden says it actually comes to what seems to be intention and purpose, where there was some kind of an intervention about 200,000 years ago. And Kryon has an explanation for that too. I'll save that till I read a little bit more from Gregg. But I find the scientist of me is best as observer. In other words, I don't have to decide just when I observe something or hear something whether I think it's true or not true. It's just like one more data point, one more data point, one more data point. And then I find the intuitive part of me, the spiritual part of me, starts putting these things together anyway. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense to me, even if I can't prove it all scientifically, which is why science is catching up with consciousness. You know, it's needing now that this other kinds of information is coming from other sources to document or prove or show or investigate some of these things that are out there.
Because we really know. We know somewhere. That's why if something feels right, it's...
Yes, it probably is.
Yeah.
So that's one, and I'll read some of these summary statements that Gregg Braden calls keys here in a few minutes. But the other thing that he called out, which kind of blew my mind, and it goes to heart as the center of things, and coherence between the brain and the heart as important, is the idea of what love is and what compassion is. So I want to read a page or two here from this part where he was trained as a geologist. He worked for in California. I think it was for the information industry, or maybe it was the aerospace industry. And ever since he was a kid, when he was 8 or 9, his family was not very functional. He was taken away from his mom, placed in a foster home, and it turns out that that family had in their basement, and he was shown as a 9-year-old after they got to know who he was and what he was interested in. And he was interested in the ancient and indigenous religions, you know, the ones that have been around forever and ever and ever. He was shown the library in the basement that was like walls and walls and floor to ceiling books on ancient cultures. And as a 9-year-old, he devoured it. He read it. And then as an adult, he would take groups on tours to find some of these places where there's still abbots and monks from a long tradition. In Tibet, when you could still get into Tibet, he took a group, and they had to go up this ridiculously high, steep mountain. It looked like, from his pictures, it was all but impossible to get into, but they did. And then it took them days to get used to the thin air and days to get used to the temperature, the coolness of it all. So this is an excerpt from his report of his visit with the abbot. And he said he asked this, every time he visited a new or different tradition, he asked the same kind of questions to see what kind of answers he got. His background is partially Native American, so that was part of what sparked his interest. So here he is, he's gotten in to see the abbot after 10 or 12 days of being there with his group. They finally settled in. There's a translator, Tibetan and English, and Gregg asks through the translator, "In your tradition," I began, "what is the force that connects us with other people, our world, and all things? What is the conduit that carries our prayers beyond our bodies and the stuff that holds the universe together?" With a smile that never left his face, the abbot held eye contact with me as our translator repeated my question in Tibetan. What happened next came as a surprise to me and the others in the room. Immediately, the two men, the abbot and the translator, began a loud and lively exchange with animated gestures and enthusiastic emphasis that began to sound like a Tibetan shouting match. While my Tibetan is terrible and I couldn't understand a single word that either man was saying, the nature of the conversation seemed obvious. They were struggling with the meaning of my question and where it fit into the abbot's teachings. He was accustomed to answering such questions from familiar students who had already studied with him and had years of training that would prepare them for such a conversation. It's like getting a question on A Course in Miracles from Course in Miracles students versus the Tibetan abbot. But the abbot didn't know me. He had no idea of my background, my traditions, or my spiritual experience. And he simply didn't know where and how to begin his answer. Answering me as he might answer a lifelong monk would be like parents telling a young child where babies come from without the child first having the benefit of knowing about the biology of intimate human relations. While such a question could be answered, for the child the answer wouldn't make sense without the prior knowledge. In a similar way, the abbot knew he could answer my question regarding the force that connects all things. What he didn't know is if I would understand his answer. Suddenly the room became quiet. Everyone stopped talking and the abbot lifted his gaze upward to the thangas which covers the chapel walls, the tapestries. After inhaling deeply the cool, thin air, he answered my question in a way that was both surprising and unexpected. He looked at me and simply spoke one Tibetan word. Instinctively, I glanced to the translator. What did he just say? I asked. It was only one word. I wasn't prepared for what I heard next from my translator. Compassion, he said. The Geshe says that compassion is the answer to your question. Compassion is what connects us to every creature and to all things. The reason I was surprised by the answer is because in my experience, compassion had been taught as an experience and a practice. We feel compassion for ourselves and for others who are facing difficult life circumstances. We also experience compassion as a practice in our daily lives. If I understood the abbot's answer correctly, he was now telling us that compassion is more than a feeling, it's a force of nature. For compassion. I remember leaving the monastery that day, feeling incomplete, like there was something that had been literally lost in translation. The answer from the abbot was a bit mysterious and didn't seem to make sense. Something just didn't fit. A few days later, I discovered the reason why. Yet another monastery, this time with a scholarly monk rather than a high-ranking abbot, I found myself engaged in the same conversation once again. This time, however, we were in the caught years of similar lamps burning for heat and light, just the way they were on that cold afternoon. Once again, through the translator, I posed the same question to the monks. Is compassion a force of creation, or is it an experience in the body? He rolled his eyes to the soot on the ceiling where I had been looking only seconds before. With a deep sigh, he thought for a moment. Drawing from what he had learned in the monastery since he had entered at the age of 8, he now appeared to be in his mid-20s. Slowly he lowered his eyes and looked at me as he responded. The answer was short, it was powerful, and it made tremendous sense. It is both, were the words that came back to me from the monk. Compassion is both a force of nature and a human experience. In that moment, the earlier encounter with the abbot suddenly made sense, and I understood the deep teaching that he had shared with me and the members of my tour group. So we're coming to an end. There's a few summaries from, no, I'm not going to do that. There's statements in the back of this book that Gregg Braden calls keys. They're spread all through the explanation as he goes. And he explains in a more compact, sequential way the idea about evolution not being true for humans and the force of compassion or love. So here's what Lee is summarizing that Kryon had previously channeled. first of all, things are not as they were. Things have changed. There was a change in 2012, and we have made it over the hump as a civilization and a culture and a world to be going to the next stage. And another statement, human nature changes. It's not static. It can change. And that has a lot to do with whether we're willing to believe and exercise our right to choose, our ability to choose, as pointed out by the science that was in this conference, by A Course in Miracles, and by lots of other teachers that you may have been exposed to. And then he's talking about the indigo children who are now part of the new changed atmosphere. And he says about them, they won't do dumb. If they're hired to work at McDonald's and they work there for 3 or 4 weeks and they say to the boss, oh, if you did this first and then this and moved this here and did this there, it would be much more if cost-effective, usable, workable. And they say, no, we're not changing anything, the kids will quit. So they're basically at the point where they're system busters. They're not going to keep doing what's dumb if they know better.
I like that term. System busters. I like that.
And then,
Those are my family.
yeah, I think I have one in my family too.
I don't know.
He's one of the early indigo kids who weren't called that at that point.
So,
And then he says, in the Great Awakening, which we are in the midst of, the changes include basic respect, human to human, everywhere, and synchronization. In other words, when I learn something, it'll translate in quantum kinds of ways that we may not even understand. It's like the butterfly. Yeah, 100 monkeys and the butterfly effect. You know, the wings flapping here on this side of the globe can make a change on the other side of the globe. And then he says there are what he calls wild cards now that Bonnie has spoken of as well. And so a couple examples are things that wouldn't have happened before and that are part of the Great Awakening and that are shaking things up. They're part of what are making the new world. Like in May of this year, all of the bishops from the Catholic Church in Chile resigned en masse because of grave negligence over sexual abuse. I mean, that's almost unheard of. First of all, that the Pope would have actually gone, and I think it took him 2 rounds. The first time he sort of passed over it, but then he went back, and all those bishops resigned together for that. And another one is Kryon predicted what he calls a probability, a potential of the new young Northern Korean leader possibly choosing to denuclearize and make peace, because that too would give him what he actually wanted, which is the adoration of his people and a place in history that was monumental. Now, Kryon said that a while back, that this isn't a prediction because we all still have free will and other things are happening and it depends on how the energy goes between now and then. But it turns out that with President Trump in North Korea not that long ago, there was that handshake and he promised to denuclearize. Now the reaction, the future will be like the past reaction of the press and everybody around and all the experts say, oh, that'll never happen. It's never happened before, it's never been like that, it'll never happen. And so that's put like a wet blanket on it. But he's still young. It still will have to work itself out to see whether the nuclear weapons are actually discharged. I read some little tiny thing in the newspaper within the last week or two that said something about some inspector said that there are signs that they are in fact dismantling some of their nuclear weapons. They have started. So those are some examples of wild cards. And then another message from Kryon is peace on earth, it is coming. And the technology for peaceful living will be given. It's available. It will be given. It's not being given right now because it could still be weaponized and humans are not ready. Humans are not ready yet.
Elon Musk is working on that.
On them being, humans being ready, or?
No, he's working on it being.
Oh, the technology being
technology.
ready when the time comes.
Breaking the paradigm.
Yes, yes, and this is part of the Great Awakening, right? And Kryon also used the word atonement. Atonement is happening across humanity. We are looking to women and children and slaves and places where heart hurts have been historical and patterned. We're making reparation. There's a new paradigm. We will look at the problem and it will stop. It will stop. So it's part of a trend where we're making these reparations and preparing humanity to be ready for the technology that we can live by peacefully. And then humanity is at the threshold. He says, we are ready to go. And then he finished it with something like, got light? So that certainly isn't all of it. But if you're interested in receiving an email that has the titles of all these books and some follow-up for these presenters, you can put your name and your email on here. So we can, if you want to ask questions, we can do that either on or off camera. And otherwise, the official presentation portion is over.
If